Greetings, Culture Warriors. It is I, Jeff Vieira, author of Culture is Everything, and your host for this latest Dispatch from the Front. Today we'll take a look at a company called the Boohoo Group, PLC. In this Bloomberg story by Deidre Hipwell and Thomas Mullier. Boohoo plunges after reports of labor abuses at suppliers. Boohoo Group PLC shares plunged after a report in the Sunday Times about poor working conditions at a factory the newspaper described as a supplier of the UK online fashion retailer. Boohoo said it will review its supply chain after the report, which focused on a garment workshop in Leicester, England, the site of a recent flare-up in coronavirus infections. The shares fell as much as 12% early Monday in London. The Sunday Times said an undercover reporter worked at the factory where social distancing measures weren't being observed and employees were paid £3.5, that's $4.40 an hour, less than half the minimum wage. The newspaper said the reporter was helping pack boxes of Boohoo's Nasty Gal line. The UK's National Crime Agency said that within the last few days, officials have visited a number of business premises in the Leicester area to assess concerns of modern slavery and human trafficking. The agency did not identify the companies involved. Tackling modern slavery is one of our highest priorities, and we are committed to working with partners across law enforcement, the private, public, and charity sector to pursue offenders and protect victims, the agency said in a statement. Online clothing retail has boomed as the pandemic has spurred a surge in e-commerce. Boohoo shares have gained more than 70% in the past year. Boohoo said the factory cited in the Sunday Times report isn't an official supplier, and it suspects another company is occupying the facilities. While the location has a sign with the name Jaswal Fashions, that company went out of business, according to Boohoo. The online retailer said it will review its relationship with any garment supplier that may be subcontracting at the factory, and it will stop business with any company that doesn't adhere to the letter or spirit of its code of conduct. Boohoo should hire lawyers and advisors to conduct an independent inquiry, wrote Wayne Brown, an analyst at Liberum. The response from Boohoo does not go far enough, said the analyst, who cut his price target on the stock 30% to 350 pence. The statement only really speaks of investigating the particular factory in question and raises the question of how many other breaches management is potentially unaware of. The Guardian said last week that suppliers in Leicester weren't imposing distancing measures to protect the health of garment workers against COVID-19 despite the local lockdown. Health Secretary Matt Hancock has said the government is prepared to shut down businesses not complying with lockdown restrictions in Leicester. Boohoo Chief Executive John Lytle has been supervising health measures in its biggest suppliers via video calls and written communications due to virus-related limitations, said a spokesperson for the company. Okay, so a little bit to unpack here, certainly. Number one is just to note that the concerns of slavery and tracking are particularly rife within the garment industry. So, clothing, in particular, has a tendency to be manufactured on kind of a microcell basis. That means kind of a worker with a sewing machine, right? And it tends to be low skill work, and so it's attractive to new immigrants in particular. There have been a lot of Indian and Chinese immigrants in particular. Now there's a growing number of Muslim immigrants from Muslim countries in England. And these tend to be jobs that are kind of ethnic friendly. In that what will happen is you'll have, a whole shop set up, and you'll have the leadership of that shop will speak whatever language from wherever the community is that they're recruiting from. And they'll run it like a little, just a little small factory within, parts of the country that are of a different ethnicity. And so it winds up being a way for these people to get a job, earn money, even though they don't speak the prevailing language. So in that sense, it is a good thing. Notice, though, that they talk about slavery and human trafficking, and yet the employees were being paid. What is typical of slavery and human trafficking situations is that you don't get paid. Your labor is completely stolen from you. But here what they're talking about is simply violations of the minimum wage. Now, economically, the minimum wage is unjustifiable. All it does by setting a minimum wage is to make a segment of the population, low-skilled workers who don't have language skills, for example, unemployable. If you rigidly enforce the minimum wage, what you would have is no first-generation immigrant in most industries being able to work. They would have to wait until they could master the language at least and have some additional skills. And since the push has been for unrestricted immigration, that's a bar that they can't meet. When you have a controlled immigration regime, you're bringing over people who have already met the standard to be employed in your country. You've done the background check. You've done the skills check. You've ensured that their values are in alignment with the prevailing values in your country so that they fit seamlessly in. This is particularly important in places that are more ethnically homogeneous, such as Japan, right? There's a lot of things that are closed to foreigners living in Japan because the Japanese are concerned that they must first fit harmoniously into their society. Very typical of Asian cultures, really. So in this case, they are getting paid. This is probably the only way they could get paid. This is probably the most money that they could make given their level of skills and language ability in England at this time. So I'm not sure it's necessarily a good thing to crack down on their ability to earn somehow. Because after all, over time, this is how they are building skills. This is how they are hopefully learning the language and the culture. And over time, their value will increase. And what they produce will increase in value. And they'll be paid commensurate with it. The reason people pay, $4.40 an hour for these jobs is because they're not worth more than $4.40 an hour. So they're probably pretty inefficient when they first start in on this. And there's probably also considerable, given the numbers of people coming in, there's probably considerable competition in the labor market to get these jobs, which people say are slavery and human trafficking. Okay. All right. So there are some values in conflict there. Number one is, I would say that on the part of the Guardian and the people kind of cracking down on this, I think there's a little bit of condescension in play. If you are going to favor bringing people into your country who don't have skills and don't have language, then one of two things is going to happen. Either you are going to increase your welfare state rolls, your people who are on the dole, because they can't work. So what are you going to do? How are they going to provide for themselves? You have to provide for them. The state will have to do that. And that means that people who are already British citizens will get either restricted benefits because now there's a bigger population requiring them, or your taxpayers will pay a more significant tax bill in order to cover it. But the money's got to come from somewhere if you're not going to let them work. The second thing that could happen is that black markets arise, such as this one. This is a good example of black market. By law, you're not allowed to pay people less than minimum wage. These people are being paid less than minimum wage. It is a black market. The work is there. The demand is there. It is not worth more per hour than what they're paying. And so they're forced to engage in criminal activity in order to meet that demand within England. The other thing that will happen is that those supply chains will move to places where there is less of a crackdown. Now, in that circumstance, what will happen is that the prices to the end customer will remain about the same. The people will be more exploited wherever it moves to. And the people here in England will have lost a way to make money. So the net, will be negative if you crack down on that. I think knowing economically that it's a negative, knowing that it's negative for the people themselves who are laboring in these factories, I think it's a clear indication of condescension on the part of the native Britons who are pushing to eradicate this. And I think it comes from the fact that they would be unwilling to work for $4.40 an hour, not realizing that these immigrants came to their country for a variety of reasons, and that $4.40 an hour to them may be more money than they could safely make in their homeland. We ran into this in America, of course, during our waves of immigration. And you always had mainly among people who were affiliated with various church movements. At the time, we also had a revival going on. And so some of the people who were most strident in trying to prevent opportunities for immigrants to work were those who claimed to be looking out for them out of fairness and out of Christian concern. In the end, you denied an opportunity to someone to improve their skills and move up. The assumption always seems to be that $4.40 an hour is all these people will ever make. And that's simply not true. They're in a land of opportunity. As their English improves, as their work skills improve, as their abilities improve, they will rise in society. That's just a fact. That's what happens in the West if it's not obstructed by people who claim to know better. My great-grandfather and my grandfather, really, were immigrants to this country. They were bricklayers and fishermen. My great-grandfather became something of a real estate mogul, in that he saw the value of property, he saw the growth that was happening, and so he worked hard in his primary professions to obtain property they could then lend out. And so then when there was construction, when the construction industry went through a downturn or the fishing industry did, and they were always cyclical, he would have a steady source of income coming in from his properties. He had many children, so this was important to him. he was able to do this because there wasn't a scold at the union hall when they were giving out bricklaying jobs, nor on the docks, preventing him from being able to earn a living, even if it was one that was too modest in the eyes of a native-born American. He was willing to do hard work. My grandfather was willing to do hard work. My father was willing to do hard work. I personally am willing to do hard work. I could not keep up with those three men in terms of work ethic, however. And so why deny someone the opportunity to better themselves, even if their starting point is not a job you would take? Well, I think there's another element beyond condescension that needs to be considered, and I think they value stratification of society. And by that I mean, especially with new immigrants, there is a tendency to resent their advancement. Here in America, we have the paradigm of the melting pot, whereas almost unique in the world, almost unique in history, all you have to do to be an American, every bit as American as a native-born American, is to adopt American values. Come here, adopt our values, and you will be an American. It's that simple. You don't have to speak unaccented English. You don't have to have a certain income level. You merely have to be recognizable culturally as an American. No one will look down on you for that. There is nothing Americans love more than a success story. Someone who, it's rife, someone who got off the boat and made something of themselves. That's why I'm so proud of my great-grandfather for having done that. Now, he wasn't a millionaire, but he made something of himself. And he set the foundation for our family down through the generations. What more could you ask? What greater legacy could you have than that? And that's open to everyone who comes to our shores. That's the meaning of that poem inscribed on the Statue of Liberty. Come here, work hard, be a good citizen, be an American. That's all we ask. It's not quite as true, I know, in Great Britain, but it's not that far off. Same thing with Canada. It's not that far off from what we consider to be the American ideal in terms of that melting pot, that assimilation. We take people from different cultures and we make them into Americans. That's what we do. But there are some people, native-born Americans, who don't like that. They yearn for an ossified aristocracy of the European model. They've got Europe envy. They've got monarch envy. These are the people who watch the coronations, unironically, who follow the royal gossip in England, as though it was something of interest to us. And they just can't stand the thought that somebody from somewhere they can't even pronounce can come here and get ahead. They don't want them to. And so they try to knock them off the first rung of the ladder and keep them dependent, because if you're not going to let them rise, well, at least you can control their vote. You can stare them. You can sign them up for the causes of their betters. And that makes you feel good because you're powerful. Right? And unfortunately, there's always been a strain of this ugly attitude in America. I imagine it prevails even more in England, where the class structure was so much more set, where the great chain of being was put into force. That having people who put on airs and try and social climb is resented. Know your place. Stay in your place. Not quite as bad as the Indian caste system, surely, but a caste system nonetheless that they're trying to preserve. And with it, their position in it. You know, in our history, in the plantation system in the South, it wasn't the masters of the plantation that you generally had to worry about if you were a slave. It was what they called the poor white trash working on the plantation. Because they resented any kindness shown towards slaves. They resisted any effort on the part of the slave to better themselves, to learn to speak well, to learn to read, to learn anything really. They resented because in their eyes it diminished their role in society. They didn't worry about the plantation master. That was well beyond them. They couldn't be masters themselves. But by God, they could be better than a slave. And that's what they sought to do. And as that plantation system evolved into the sharecropping system, many of those little masters running the various sharecropping fields, they took it out full bore on any black man who worked those cotton fields. And I think many of them had it worse during the sharecropping era than their fathers did, fathers probably, during the plantation system itself, most places. In fact, as a blues fan, one of the greatest cultural events of the last century was all those wonderful blues musicians in the Mississippi Delta on those sharecropping farms who finally gave up the cotton and came north for industrial factory jobs to Chicago, to Detroit, to Kansas City. They came north and in the process produced the electrified blues. In particular, we came to be known as the Chicago blues style. Wouldn't have had that if they didn't. They wouldn't have left. They wouldn't have packed up everything and just come to a cold place. They wouldn't have done that. But for the fact that they had an opportunity to work and actually see some benefit, not be a slave to the company store, as their fathers had been slaves to the plantation masters. And there was resentment, as you can imagine, in the places that they came to as they flooded in seeking those opportunities. But you know what? They managed to take advantage of those opportunities. And for a time, at least, till government conspired against them, they were really able to make some bold advances. That's what I think people are afraid of with regard to these communities and why they look down upon those jobs and those factories that do those jobs. The other thing I want to talk about is this notion that you are responsible for your supply chain. That was not a Boohoo factory. So why is Boohoo being named in the article? It's because Boohoo is the bigger name. I spent time at Bank of America pushing vendor controls across our mortgage supply chain and our data centers in particular. And the reason we did that was because no matter how good we were, we knew that if anyone in our supply chain fell down on the job, the headlines would read, Bank of America supplier screwed up. We'd be blamed for it. The regulators would hold our feet to the fire, not theirs. because whoever is the biggest name in the supply chain wins in that regard. You get the responsibility. You get the accountability. Clearly, the companies in question that these are subcontracted to do not feel the same respect for the law the Boohoo does. That's obvious, right? It's black market. You're paying them under the table anyway. It's cash in, cash out. Maybe a front for some other things, right? So compliance, regulatory compliance, is not a value that they share to the same degree Boohoo is. The pandemic has made it hard because one of the primary ways that you ensure compliance with your supply chain is to send somebody over there on a surprise visit to take a look, to audit them. But because of the pandemic and its impact on international travel in particular, well, you can't. And so non-compliance is going to spread. It's just a fact. So that puts pressure on you to make sure that your supply chain partners are sharing your values. So if you value compliance with the law, you better make sure all your supply chain partners do. And that means, excuse me, your primary value in sourcing and purchasing cannot be the lowest price. You have to be concerned about other things besides price. So your values may have to shift accordingly. And that's kind of a big deal in the fashion world. So another little tale where having that values and culture lens, I hope, provides a little more insight into what otherwise might be considered to be kind of an innocuous article. There's a lot going on there. There's a lot of transformative things happening. A lot of activity. And as always, it's not as black and white and simple as the media, with their black and white and simple minds, like to present it. There are trade-offs that happen here. There are values that are in conflict. How do you value the advancement of an immigrant generation versus the need to avoid human trafficking and slavery, the need to ensure that our laws are enforced domestically, the need to make sure that people are accountable to see that those laws are enforced? Rule of law versus opportunity, economic opportunity. Those are in tension. Which do you value? I guarantee you that that immigrant population values economic opportunity over rule of law. That's why they're doing what they're doing. I guarantee you that the company of Boohoo values rule of law over the economic opportunity. That's why they're doing what they're doing. Perfectly rational approaches to this situation. But because we know culture and we understand the values behind it, we can understand it a lot better, and we can anticipate some of the unintended consequences of going through crackdowns like this and slapping labels like slavery and human trafficking on what is actually people working. These are low-skilled workers. The real scandal here is, why are we bringing so many low-skilled workers without language skills into a place where they cannot work? Either change the law so they can work and they can improve their lot in society, or acknowledge the fact that you're just padding out your welfare rolls. And you're going to live with that for the first generation of immigrants. And then the second generation, having grown up there, will hopefully have the skills and the language competency necessary in order to be successful right out of the gate. But be honest about it. If that's what you're doing, and it's really a humanitarian effort, great. Claim that. But do not bring over a bunch of people and then, by law, exclude them from the ability to work. People need to work. It's part of our DNA. It's really the source of much of human dignity. And yet is being denied, in many cases, these people. I would argue for not the best of intentions always. And there are problems when you do that. You're creating a second-class citizenry that is only going to result in difficulties in the form of social problems later on. Have a great day.